Hello. Tonight we will immerse ourselves in a fascinating journey through one of the darkest and most transformative periods in history, the time of the Black Plague and how it was to survive this devastating plague. Before getting comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there. It is always fascinating to see who joins us from different parts of the world. Now, turn down the lights, maybe turn on a fan to create a soft background murmur, and let's delve into tonight's journey. Congratulations! You have just woken up in Europe in the year 1347. The morning air feels fresh as you open your eyes and stretch on your straw mattress. You're not in a private bedroom like the one you're used to. You are in a one-room cabin with the rest of your family. The walls are made of lee and dorb. You know, a wooden frame filled with a mixture of mud, clay, and straw. It is actually quite good at keeping the cold out, although the straw roof often leaks when it rains heavily. As you get up, your nose fills with familiar smells. The smoky aroma from the fireplace of the night before, the earthy smell of the ground under your feet, and the characteristic smell of unwashed bodies. Bathing was not something done very often in the Middle Ages. The good news is that no one notices because everyone smells more or less the same. Your stomach growls with hunger. If you are lucky, there may be some bread left from yesterday, although it is likely hard as a stone. You would soften it with a little beer. Yes, even children drink weak beer in those times. It is often safer than water, which can make you seriously ill if drawn from a contaminated source. Outside your small cabin, the village is already coming to life. You hear the distant mooing of cattle, the clucking of chickens, and the voices of your neighbors starting their daily work. Most of the people here are peasants who work the land, either as free tenants who pay rent to the local lord or as serfs tied to the land who must provide labor services. Life has a predictable rhythm in your medieval village. The days are measured by sunrise and sunset, the weeks by the ringing of church bells calling you to mass, and the years by the changing seasons and the cycle of planting and harvesting. It is a hard life, no doubt, but it is the only one you have known. What you do not know, what no one in Europe knows yet, is that everything is about to change. A shadow looms over the continent, one that will transform society as war or hunger never have. The first rumors reach your village from the mouth of a traveling merchant. He brings exotic goods from faraway places, silks from the Orient, spices from faraway lands. But this time, he brings something more. Stories. Terrifying stories about a disease devastating cities along trade routes. People are dying by the thousands, he says, affected by a mysterious disease that causes fever, painful swellings, and an almost certain death. Some villagers cross themselves and murmur prayers. Others dismiss the accounts as exaggerations. After all, alarming rumors often spread faster than the truth. The merchant continues on his way, and for a while, life continues as normal. But the rumors persist, becoming more frequent and terrifying as the months pass. In autumn, the whispers have become cries of alarm. The disease has reached the Mediterranean ports of Europe, Messina, Marseille, Venice. They say that ships have arrived at the ports full of nothing but corpses as the sailors died during the voyage. God, save us all, your mother murmurs upon hearing the news, making the sign of the cross. In your village, people begin to prepare as best they can, although no one really knows for what. Some store extra food. Others spend more time in church, praying for divine protection. The local healer gathers herbs and remedies, though no one can say if they will be effective against this unknown affliction. The first cases arrive in your region during the cold winter months. A neighboring town, just half a day away, reports several sudden deaths. The victims suffered high fevers, complained of terrible thirst, and developed strange black swellings in their armpits and groin. Few survived more than 3 days after showing the symptoms. The elders of your village gather to discuss what should be done. Some suggest closing the village to outsiders, while others argue that trade and communication must continue. In the end, life goes on, albeit with a new sense of fear. Then, one fresh morning, a young man who works at the mill does not show for his tasks. When someone goes to check on him, They find him burning with fever, his body covered in sweat, and his neck swollen with a painful lump the size of a hen's egg. The plague has arrived in your village. What follows is a time of horror unlike you had ever imagined. The disease spreads at a terrifying speed. One day a person is healthy, the next day they have a fever, and on the third day, in most cases, they are dead. The black buboes that give the disease its name, the Black Death, are indescribably painful. Some victims cough up blood, suggesting that the disease has reached their lungs, and these unfortunates rarely survive more than a day or two. It is a punishment from God, some say, flagellating themselves in penance for their sins. It is the stale air, others claim, carrying bouquets of flowers to ward off the fetid miasma that they believe causes the disease. It is the Jews who poison the wells, some murmur with a somber air. Although in your town there are no Jewish residents, such accusations do not make much sense. The truth that no one in the 14th century could know is that the Black Death is caused by a bacterium called Yersinia pestis. This tiny organism travels in the gut of fleas, which in turn lodge on rats. These rats, stowaways on ships, and constant companions in medieval cities and towns, have unknowingly transported death across continents. When an infected flea bites a human, it regurgitates the bacteria into the wound. The bacteria multiply rapidly, often causing inflammation of the lymph nodes, those painful buboes. If the bacteria reach the lungs, it causes pneumonic plague, which can be transmitted directly from person to person through coughing and breathing. But you know none of this. All you know is that people are dying and no one seems able to stop it. Your town, like thousands of others throughout Europe, is transformed by the plague. The church bells, which previously rang to mark the hours and call people to prayer, now ring constantly for the dead. In the end, there are too many deaths to announce, and the bells fall silent. The dead are buried quickly, with hardly any ceremony. Gone are the elaborate funeral rites that once marked a person's passage from this world to the next. Now corpses are collected in carts and taken to mass graves. Some families, devastated by multiple deaths, have no one to bury their dead, and corpses may remain in homes for days until neighbors or parish officials take them away. Fear changes people's behavior toward each other. Those who have healthy relatives may close their doors to visitors, while those with sick relatives are often rejected. Some flee to the countryside, hoping that distance will protect them from the disease. Others turn to religion with renewed fervor, walking the streets and flagellating themselves to appease what they believe is divine wrath. The priests, who should be a source of comfort, are dying in alarming numbers. Their duties force them to give last rites to the dying, constantly exposing themselves to contagion. Many flee, abandoning their parishioners in this time of greatest need. Those who stay often succumb to the disease. Your family has been lucky thus far. Although the plague is wreaking havoc around you, none of your immediate family has fallen ill. You have heard stories of entire families being wiped out in neighboring towns, of children who are orphaned only to die themselves days later, of lovers separated by death within hours of vowing eternal devotion. But your luck cannot last forever in a world where the Black Death kills between a third and half of the population. One morning, your younger brother complains that he does not feel well. At noon, he has a very high fever. At night, a revealing swelling appears on his neck, and you know what it means. Your mother takes care of him day and night, bathing his feverish forehead with cold cloths, trying to get him to drink small sips of water or weak beer. Your father talks about taking him to the monastery, where monks heal the sick. But everyone knows that the monasteries are overflowing, since many brothers are victims of the plague. For 3 days, your brother's condition worsens. The bubo gets bigger, turns bright red, and then black. He has trouble breathing and screams in pain and delirium. You take turns sitting by his side, although fear makes you want to keep your distance. On the 4th day, something unexpected happens. While most plague victims worsen and die at this stage, your brother's fever subsides. He is weak, terribly weak, but alert. The bubo remains, but is softened a bit, and, in the following days, it breaks and drains. It is a disgusting but hopeful sign. Against all odds, your brother is one of the few who will survive the Black Plague. What you cannot know is why he survived when so many others died. Modern science would later discover that certain people carry a genetic mutation called Delta 32 that provides some protection against plague bacteria. This mutation affects a protein called CCR5 present on the surface of white blood cells, making it difficult for bacteria to enter and hijack immune cells. It is very possible that your brother carries this mutation, as do other members of your family. This genetic peculiarity, a random accident of nature, would give certain families and individuals a chance to fight the deadliest pandemic in human history. And, strangely enough, centuries later, scientists would discover that this same mutation also provides protection against another deadly disease, HIV, the virus that causes AIDS. The Black Plague, by selecting survivors with this genetic trait, would unknowingly help protect some of their descendants from a disease that would not exist until 600 years later. But that is a story for another time. For now, your family celebrates your brother's recovery as the miracle it seems. Not everyone is so lucky. As the weeks pass, the plague continues its deadly work. Your town, which once had about 200 souls, has been reduced to fewer than 100. The fields lie abandoned, as those who work them have died or are too busy taking care of the sick or burying the dead. The lord of the mansion, who lives in a stone house on the hill overlooking the town, has lost his wife and 2 children. Not even wealth and privilege offer protection against the Black Plague. Interestingly, some people seem immune to the plague despite being constantly exposed. The town gravedigger, an unpleasant character who steals from the dead before burying them, handles plague-ridden corpses daily but never shows symptoms. A midwife who attends to the sick when she is not assisting births also remains healthy despite her dangerous work. Like your brother, they may carry a genetic protection, although the people of the Middle Ages would attribute their survival to divine intervention or perhaps suspicious dealings with dark forces. Food is scarce, as the harvest is neglected and trade has reduced. The price of basic products skyrockets, while anything considered a possible remedy, certain herbs, exotic treatments, or religious relics, becomes astronomically expensive if it can be obtained. As winter approaches, the plague begins to subside, not by human intervention, but by the natural cycle of the disease. Fleas are less active in the cold, and rats tend to stay close to their nests. For a brief period, there is hope that the worst is over. But the Black Plague is not over. It only retreats to return with the warmth of spring, finding new victims among the survivors of the first wave. Over the next 4 years, from 1347 to 1351, successive waves of plague will sweep Europe, killing between 75 and 200 million people, perhaps half of Europe's total population. The world that emerges from this catastrophe will be fundamentally changed. The enormous decrease in population will disrupt the feudal system. It will increase the value of labor and change power dynamics between peasants and nobility. Religious authority will be questioned, as people will wonder why their prayers have not been heard and why so many priests abandon their duties. Medical knowledge, based largely on ancient texts and superstitions, will be challenged by the plague's challenge to traditional treatments. For the survivors, people like your brother, the gravedigger, or the midwife, life will never be the same again. They're the lucky ones, although they carry the burden of having survived in a world of loss. They will rebuild societies, renegotiate their relationships with the authority, and, little by little, they will build a post-apocalyptic world that, for better or for worse, will put Europe on the path towards modernity. But that is a story for another night. For now, as you fall asleep, imagine yourself as one of those medieval survivors, contemplating the first stars appearing in the night sky above your village. The plague has passed, at least now. You have survived humanity's darkest hour. And although you don't know it yet, you are on the cusp of a new world born from the ashes of the old. The soft sound of your breathing mixes with the nocturnal noises from outside. A dog barks in the distance. The leaves whisper in the soft breeze. Despite everything, despite the unimaginable loss and suffering, life goes on. And in that simple fact lies perhaps the most important lesson of the Black Death: the extraordinary capacity of humanity to resist, adapt, and ultimately move forward. The morning after your brother's miraculous recovery, a strange mix of emotions invades you. Without a doubt, you feel relief, but it is tinged with something unknown. A sensation of wondering why your family was saved when so many others were not. That strange survivor's guilt, that feeling of unworthiness amid widespread suffering, which torments many of those who survive catastrophes. Your brother is weak, yet alert. His eyes are clear for the first time in days. The wound on his neck has left an ugly scar that will mark him for life, a permanent reminder of his brush with death. But a scar is infinitely preferable to a grave, and your family treats each day of his recovery as the gift that it is. "Why have I survived when so many died?" he asks one night, his voice still hoarse from illness. Your mother lights a rushlight candle as night falls, pausing before answering. "It is the will of God," she says simply, although her tone suggests she is not entirely convinced. The truth, which no one in the 14th century could understand, is far more complex. Throughout the history of humanity, infectious diseases have acted as powerful forces for natural selection. Those with genetic advantages against specific pathogens survive in greater proportion and transmit these protective traits to future generations. The Black Death is perhaps the most dramatic example of this process in human history. Deep within your brother's cells, and perhaps also in yours, lies a genetic mutation that alters a protein called CCR5 on the surface of white blood cells. This mutation, known as delta 32, creates a shortened version of the protein that makes it difficult for plague bacteria to enter and hijack immune cells. Some people have one copy of this mutation, which provides them with partial protection. A lucky few have two copies, which gives them considerable resistance to the disease. It is a genetic lottery, and your brother holds the winning ticket. But the cost of this evolutionary advantage is measured in millions of lives. Those who did not have the protective mutation and succumb to the Black Death. As your brother regains strength and ventures outside for the first time since falling ill, you realize how much the town has changed. The gardens, once carefully cared for, are now neglected. The houses are empty. Their owners have died or fled. The rhythmic sounds of daily work, the blacksmith's hammer, the weaver's loom, and the miller's wheel, have disappeared or faded. However, amid this desolation, signs of resistance emerge. A market day is organized, smaller than before, but full of the energy of survivors determined to keep living. Farmers from the outlying areas bring the products they have managed to harvest. A traveling merchant, braver or more reckless than most, arrives with salt, spices, and news from distant places. The news is the same everywhere. The devastation followed by an initial recovery. No place has been spared, although some suffered more than others. Cities, with their crowded conditions and poor sanitation, have been particularly affected. Some small, isolated villages high in the mountains or deep in the forests have fared better, although few have escaped it completely. In your region, perhaps half the population has perished. In some places, the number of victims is even higher. The merchant speaks of ghost towns where not a living soul remains, of monasteries where all the monks lie dead in their cells, of noble families completely exterminated, and their large estates left without heirs. But it also speaks of places where life continues with surprising normality, of communities that unite to care for the orphans and widows, of gestures of unexpected kindness in times of overwhelming difficulty. A particular story catches your attention now. In a town much like yours, a woman named Elizabeth lost her husband and 6 children to the plague in just 1 week. She dragged each of their bodies to a hill behind her house, burying them herself, one by one. However, somehow, despite this intimate contact with the disease, Elizabeth never became sick. Like your brother and the town gravedigger, she seemed to have a certain natural immunity, that same genetic protection that modern science would one day identify later. They say she is a witch, the merchant confesses, lowering his voice, even though no one nearby can hear him. How else could she touch the dead and remain alive? Some wanted to drown her in the pond, but most were just grateful to have someone willing to bury their dead. Such rumors are common in these desperate times. Those who survive against all odds, especially if they are women who live alone or people with unusual habits or appearances, are often suspected of having dark dealings. Fear and superstition flourish along with the plague, sometimes claiming victims of their own. Your father, who has been listening to the merchant's stories, shakes his head. There is no witchcraft in survival, he says firmly. Some are simply more resistant to the disease, like my son. He puts a proud hand on your brother's shoulder. The merchant nods, pleased and careful not to contradict a potential customer. It is true. In every town there are people whom the plague cannot touch, God's chosen ones, perhaps. With the arrival of winter, which brings an intense cold and early darkness, your town adapts to a new routine. There are fewer mouths to feed, meaning food reserves will last longer than usual. It is a small relief, but there are also fewer hands to cut firewood, repair houses, care for livestock, and perform the 100 daily tasks necessary to survive in the Middle Ages. This labor shortage causes subtle but significant changes in the relationship between peasants and nobility. Your father, a skilled carpenter, suddenly finds himself in high demand now. The lord of the manor, who previously would have simply ordered his services, is now forced to negotiate better conditions for urgent repairs to the manor house. He has offered me a silver penny for 3 days of work, your father tells your mother one night, in a low, astonished voice. And a piece of bacon, too. A salary like that would have been unthinkable before the plague's arrival. But with half the region's artisans dead, those who survive see their skills valued as never before. Similar changes spread through all levels of society now. Day laborers, previously abundant and easily replaceable, now demand higher wages for their work done. Domestic servants, especially those with experience in managing a large house, are sought after by noble families whose staff has been decimated by the disease. Women also find new opportunities in this reorganized world. Widows, who previously would have remarried quickly, now often choose to maintain their independence and run the businesses their deceased husbands left them. The restrictions of the guilds, which previously prevented women from practicing certain professions, are informally relaxed out of necessity. A woman from a neighboring town takes over her husband's blacksmith shop, which scandalizes traditionalists but provides an essential service that no one else can offer. For the serfs, peasants legally bound to the land they work, the plague creates unprecedented mobility. Many lords, desperate to maintain the productivity of their fields, offer freedom to serfs willing to stay and work. Others discover they can simply leave, moving to cities or other places where conditions are better now. With the fear that the dead will prevent their return, it is increasingly difficult to enforce such restrictions. Not all of these changes happen immediately, though. Of course, the feudal system that has structured European society for centuries does not collapse overnight. No. But the seeds of transformation are planted in these first years after the plague and will grow in the decades following. As for your family, you adapt to the new reality as best you all can. Your brother regains his strength, although he tires more easily than he did before. Your father discovers that his skills as a carpenter are in high demand, allowing him to earn more money than ever. Your mother dedicates herself to washing clothes in the manor house, a job now better paid due to the labor shortage. You yourself find opportunities that would not have existed before. The parish priest, one of the few clergymen who did not die or flee during the worst of the plague, needs someone to help him to keep the church records. With basic literacy, unusual for a peasant child, taught by your mother, once in service to a noble house, you are suited for the task. Spring arrives, bringing with it both hope and fear. The warmer climate brings forth new life. The crops sprout in the fields, the wildflowers at the meadows, and the birds return from their winter journeys. But it also brings conditions allowing the plague to spread again. Indeed, new cases appear in the early summer. This second wave is less devastating than the first one. There are fewer people to infect, and many remaining may carry some genetic resistance. Even so, each new death reopens the community's barely healed wounds. One afternoon, while you're helping the priest update the parish death register, a terribly long document, you ask a question that has been bothering you. "Father, why has God sent this plague?" The priest, an older man whose face is marked by exhaustion, reflects before answering. "Some say it is punishment for sin," he says at last. "Others believe it is a test of our faith. The Pope himself has called for prayer and penance to end this scourge." He dips his pen in ink and adds another name to the register. "But I have seen the most pious die in agony, while notorious sinners live unharmed. I have prayed by the bedside of innocent children as the plague took them." He sighs deeply. Perhaps it is not for us to understand God's plan. This crisis of faith is repeated throughout communities in Europe. The plague challenges medieval religious understanding. If it is divine punishment, why does it affect the virtuous and sinners equally? If prayer and penance are the cure, why do devout monasteries suffer some of the highest mortality? The authority of the Church, which was once almost absolute in matters of earthly misfortunes, begins to show cracks that will widen in the centuries to come. Medical knowledge faces similar challenges too. Doctors trained in the most prestigious universities do not prove to be more effective than village healers in treating the plague. Their elaborate theories based on bodily humors and astronomical alignments fail to explain why some recover while others die, why some communities suffer more than others do. Some doctors bravely care for the sick, often sacrificing their own lives. Others flee at the first sign of outbreak, prioritizing personal survival over professional duty. Those who stay often wear distinctive protective clothing, long wax-covered robes, gloves, and a mask shaped like a bird's beak filled with herbs and spices believed to purify air. This strange attire, which would become iconic in later outbreaks, does nothing to protect them from the actual source of infection. In the absence of effective official treatment, communities develop their own responses to plague. Some are based on superstition, such as wearing talismans, reciting spells, or avoiding black cats or redheads. Others have surprising practical value, such as isolating the sick, burning belongings of plague victims, and maintaining cleanliness. None offers complete protection, but these community practices sometimes help limit the spread. Your town adopts several of these measures, too. Houses where plague has struck are marked with white crosses on their doors. Visitors from outside town must wait 3 days in a designated cabin before entering, ensuring they show no signs of illness. The dead are buried quickly now. With minimal ceremony, their belongings get burned. These precautions help, but they cannot stop the plague completely. In midsummer, your village has lost a dozen more people in this second wave. A heavy blow to a community already decimated by the first outbreak. One victim is the Lord of Mana himself, a man in his 50s who survived the first wave, but succumbed to the second. His death has repercussions throughout the local social hierarchy. His son, barely 20 and newly arrived from the university in Paris, inherits the mansion and its lands. This new lord, young and influenced by the novel ideas of his education, takes a different approach to managing the estate than his father did. Aware of the labor shortage and the changes in the power dynamics, he offers better conditions to the tenant farmers. The serfs who agree to stay and work the land are granted freedom and more favorable rents. Those with specialized skills, including your father, receive privileges previously reserved for those of higher social rank. Not all nobles adapt so easily to the new reality. On neighboring farms, some lords try to impose the old restrictions more harshly, prohibiting peasants from leaving, punishing those who demand higher wages, and using force to maintain the old order. These efforts rarely succeed for long. The peasants simply leave to seek better conditions elsewhere. With abundant land and a worker shortage, they have no shortage of opportunities. The second wave of the plague finally subsides with autumn's arrival. Your town has survived, diminished but intact. Of the original 200 inhabitants, perhaps 90 remain. The fields have been consolidated, prioritizing the cultivation of the most fertile lands. The houses are empty. The wood and mud have been gradually recovered for other uses. However, life has an extraordinary capacity to normalize even after a catastrophe. The children are playing again in the town square. The rhythm of agricultural life, sowing, cultivation, and harvesting continues, adapting to the labor reduction. Weddings are celebrated. Babies are born. Trade resumes. On a clear autumn day, an unexpected visitor arrives in the town. A bricklayer who had left years ago to seek work in the cities. He built a good life in Florence. He tells everyone who wants to listen, working in the city's magnificent cathedral. But when the plague arrived, it devastated the city more than any rural area. I saw half of Florence die, he says, his eyes tormented by memories. The rich fled to their estates in the countryside, but the poor had nowhere to go. The corpses piled up in the streets faster than they could be buried. I survived. God knows how. Once the worst was over, the cathedral work stopped. With so many dead, priorities focused on essential reconstruction. The bricklayer, finding himself without stable employment, decided to return to his birthplace. His story is not unique. Throughout Europe, the plague causes a temporary setback in the trend towards urbanization. Cities, with their crowded conditions, are perfect breeding grounds for disease. Many of those who survive flee to the countryside, seeking safety in open spaces and smaller communities. This urban exodus brings unexpected benefits to rural towns like yours. People return with new skills, new ideas, and fresh perspectives gained during their time in the cities. They bring with them accounts of different ways of life, of technological innovations, of political systems different from the feudal structure of rural areas. The bricklayer, for example, describes how Florence was not governed by a hereditary noble, but by elected officials from the merchant class. He speaks of mechanical clocks that divide the day into precise hours, of water management systems that bring clean water to the city, of banking practices that allow trade over great distances. These ideas find fertile ground in communities already questioning traditional authorities and practices. The plague has created cracks in the medieval vision of the world, and through these cracks, new possibilities arise. For you and your family, life continues in this altered landscape. Your brother, fully recovered, though marked by his encounter with the plague, becomes an apprentice to the returned bricklayer, learning the trade that will provide him a secure future in a world where these skills are increasingly valued. Your father's carpentry keeps the family comfortable. His services now command a salary that would have been unimaginable before the plague. Your mother no longer washes clothes, but focuses on an herb garden that produces remedies in high demand since the plague decimated traditional healers. You continue to help the priest with parish records. Your literacy and agile mind make you valuable in a community where those skills are uncommon. In the old world, your peasant origin would limit your prospects regardless of your abilities. In the post-plague world, with its fluid social borders and its desperate need for talent wherever it is found, opportunities open up before you. One night, while your family sits around the hearth, sharing a more abundant meal than you would have ever imagined in the years prior to the plague, your father expresses what many think. It's terrible to say this. He begins hesitantly. But for those of us who survived, life is better now than before. Your mother nods slowly. More food, better salaries, more freedom. She agrees. Built on countless tombs. It is the uncomfortable truth that would have been unthinkable in the overpopulated and rigidly hierarchical pre-plague society. However, these benefits come at an immense cost. The lives of millions, the destruction of families, shattered communities, the knowledge and culture lost with those who carried it. No survivor can fully enjoy their improved circumstances without the shadow of this knowledge. As you fall asleep that night, you wonder about the future. The plague has receded for now, but no one believes it is gone forever. It will return as it has before, bringing new waves of death. However, humanity will survive, adapting to each outbreak, developing new responses, gradually accumulating knowledge that will eventually defeat this invisible enemy. What you cannot know is that you stand at a turning point in history. The world that will emerge from the ashes of the Black Plague will be fundamentally different from the previous one. The seeds of the Renaissance are planted in these years of recovery. The rigid feudal system is beginning its slow decline. The unquestionable authority of traditional power structures has been shaken, both secular and religious. And at a biological level, the plague has reshaped the human species itself, selecting genetic traits that will influence health and resistance to disease for generations to come. Your brother's survival, far from simple luck, represents an evolutionary chapter in humanity's endless dance with the microscopic organisms that sustain and threaten us. Tomorrow, as a new day dawns in your transformed world, you will continue with the work of reconstruction, adaptation, and searching for a path forward. That is what plague survivors have always done throughout history. They continue to bear the weight of memory as they look toward the future. And in doing so, they reshape the world in ways that will resonate for centuries. The survival story that we followed through the 14th century Black Plague is not the only story of courage and genetic luck in humanity's long dance with the plague. As the soft darkness of sleep envelopes you, let's travel back to another town, another outbreak, and another story of sacrifice and survival. It has been 300 years since the first waves of the Black Plague swept through Europe. It is the summer of 1665, and we find ourselves in Eyam, a small town nestled in the hills of Derbyshire, England. Eyam, as you know, is pronounced the same as. It is a peaceful community of about 800 souls, mostly farmers and lead miners who work the rich veins beneath the calcareous landscape. Life here follows the familiar rhythms of rural England. The villagers rise with the sun, tend their fields and animals, work in the small local industries, attend religious services at the parish church of St. Lawrence, and gather at the local tavern to share news and company. It is a close-knit community where everyone knows each other, where families have lived for generations, and where neighborhood bonds have been forged through shared joys and sorrows. What the inhabitants of Eyam do not know is that they're about to face the greatest test imaginable, one that will inscribe the name of their town in history and consecrate their collective sacrifice as legend. The plague has returned to England. In London, the disease that people still call the Black Plague, although we now know it as bubonic plague, is wreaking havoc on the crowded streets of the capital. When it is over, it will have killed about 100,000 Londoners, almost a quarter of the city's population. This outbreak will go down in history as the Great Plague of London, the last major epidemic of bubonic plague in England. For now, the towns of Eyam feel safe in their isolation. The plague is a city problem, they tell themselves, and it is unlikely to reach their remote community nestled in the hills of Derbyshire, far from major trade routes and urban centers. But fate has other plans. In late August 1665, a package arrives in Eyam addressed to the local tailor, Alexander Hadfield. It contains a package of fabrics from London, perhaps designs of the latest fashion or fabrics that cannot be found in the area. Hadfield's assistant, George Vickers, who is staying with the tailor and his family, opens the package. The fabrics are damp after their long journey, so Vickers hangs them by the fire to dry, unaware that he is releasing the deadly cargo hidden among the folds, fleas carrying the plague bacterium, Yersinia pestis. Within days, George Vickers becomes ill with a very high fever. Revealing buboes, inflamed and painful lymph nodes, appear on his neck and armpits. The town watches in horror as this strong young man deteriorates rapidly. On September 7, 1665, wie kam dies? He is the first plague victim in Eyam. Panic spreads through the community as more people get sick. At the end of September, another 4 Eyam residents have died, all from homes near Vickers' lodging. The plague has gained its first foothold. As autumn progresses, the situation worsens. More villages are affected, and the mortality rate increases. Some families lose several members in days. The fatalities mount. The natural reaction is to flee in such circumstances. In London, everyone who could afford it, including King Carlos II and his court, had fled the plagued city to seek safety in country houses. The rich residents of AM begin to prepare to leave, seeking refuge in uninfected areas until the danger passes. It is at this critical moment that two men step forward with an extraordinary proposal, one that will save countless lives beyond AM, but condemning many within the village to an almost certain death. William Messon, the newly appointed rector of and his predecessor, Thomas Stanley, put aside their religious differences. Messon, representing the established Church of England, and Stanley, who follows the Puritan tradition, present a unified plan to the village. They propose that AM voluntarily quarantine itself. No one will leave. No one will enter. The plague will be contained within its limits, preventing its spread to neighboring communities that otherwise would be in serious danger. It is a shocking proposition. In essence, the villagers are asked to sacrifice themselves, accepting that many more of them will die to protect strangers from the surrounding areas. Surprisingly, they agree. The town's boundaries become a sanitary cordon, a line between life and death that no inhabitant of AM will cross. Food and supplies are left on designated border stones by people outside the town, in particular by the Count of Devonshire from the nearby Chatsworth House, who promises to provide for the isolated villagers. The money to pay for these provisions is placed in holes filled with vinegar in the rocks, as vinegar was believed to disinfect the coins. What follows is one of the most moving and heroic episodes in humanity's long fight against infectious diseases. Summer gives way to autumn, autumn to winter, and winter to spring. Throughout this time, the plague continues its deadly work within the limits of AM. Entire families are wiped out. Children are orphaned and die within days. The houses stand empty. Their occupants are hastily buried in gardens and fields as the church cemetery quickly fills. In the midst of this tragedy, individual stories emerge that highlight the extraordinary nature of human courage, suffering, and survival. Elizabeth Hancock, wife of a farmer who lives on the Riley farm, on the outskirts of the village, suffers an almost incomprehensible loss. In just 8 days, in August 1666, the plague takes her husband and 6 children. With no one to help her, neighbors are afraid to approach the infected house. Elizabeth alone drags each corpse to a field near her house and buries them with her own hands. The most remarkable thing about Elizabeth's story is not only her unimaginable strength in the face of such devastating personal loss, is the fact that, despite handling the corpses of her entire family infected by the plague, she never contracted the disease. Like the survivors we met in our previous story, Elizabeth was likely a carrier of the CCR5 Delta 32 genetic mutation, which offers protection against plague bacteria. The Riley graves, as they are known, still stand today as a testament to a woman's suffering and resilience. Another extraordinary story is that of Marshall Howe, AAM's unofficial gravedigger. As the death toll rises, Howe takes on the grim task of burying them, not for a noble sacrifice, but for more mercenary reasons. He takes the opportunity to loot the homes of the deceased before disposing of their bodies. Despite this unpleasant behavior, Howe's story contains an element of medical mystery. He handles dozens, perhaps hundreds of infected corpses. He enters plague houses that others avoid at all costs. According to all logic, he should have been one of the first to die. However, Marshall Howe survives the entire outbreak without ever showing any symptoms of the disease. Modern science again offers a probable explanation. It is the protective genetic mutation that prevents plague bacteria from entering cells. What Howe attributes to luck or divine protection is actually the result of a small alteration in his DNA, which gives him an advantage in the evolutionary battle of humanity against a microscopic enemy. Then there's the heartbreaking story of Emmett Seidel and Roland Tora, 2 young lovers separated by the town's quarantine. Emmett lives in AAM, while Roland is from a neighboring town outside the sanitary cordon. When the quarantine takes effect, they are suddenly and indefinitely separated. Reluctant to lose contact completely, they agree to meet at a safe distance across Cucklet Dell, a natural ravine that marks part of the town's boundary. There, far enough apart to avoid any risk of contagion, they can at least see each other and exchange words of comfort and devotion. These brief, distant encounters help them get through the first months of the quarantine. But when spring gives way to the summer of 1666, and the plague reaches its peak in Emmett stops going to the meeting place, while Roland keeps showing up day after day, calling her by name, without getting an answer. Only when the quarantine finally ends does Roland discover the truth. Emmett died in April, one of the many young victims of the plague. Their love story, cut short by the disease, but marked by faithful devotion, remains one of the most enduring legends of Em. Perhaps the strangest of all is the story of Margaret Blackwell, who fell seriously ill with plague symptoms and was given up for dead by her brother Francis. In her feverish state, Margaret staggered to the kitchen desperate for a drink and mistook a container of bacon grease for milk. She drank deeply of the greasy liquid. To everyone's surprise, Margaret recovered. For centuries, the villagers told the story of how bacon grease had cured the plague. The truth is probably more complex than that. Margaret was probably carrying the genetic resistance we have discussed and would have recovered regardless of her unusual choice of drink. But the legend persisted as a reminder of how desperately people sought any treatment that could save them from the deadly clutches of the plague. Despite everything, the village's religious leaders provided what comfort they could. William Merson, who proposed the quarantine along with Thomas Stanley, pays a terrible personal price for his courageous stance. His wife, Catherine, contracts the plague while helping to care for the sick villagers and dies in her husband's arms in August 1666, at the height of the epidemic. Merson describes himself afterwards as a dying man, although he survives physically. In a letter to his children, who had been sent away before the quarantine, he writes, "The situation in this place is very sad. I beg you to flee from here. I am not in a condition to receive your comfort. I am so weak that I cannot write more." However, despite his grief, he continues to attend to his suffering congregation until the end. Religious services are moved outdoors, to Cucklet Dell, where fresh air was believed to reduce the risk of contagion. The villagers kept away from each other while they prayed, a primitive form of what we now call social distancing. Even in the darkest moments, when death seems to lurk in every shadow, the community maintains its spiritual practices and finds comfort in familiar rituals, even as the world crumbles around them. Not everyone behaved in a noble way. Of course, there are cases of looting, of neighbors refusing to help each other, of panic prevailing over compassion. One villager, Mary Cooper, tries to break the quarantine and flees to the safety of Sheffield, but is captured and returned to Em. However, these slips are exceptions. The overwhelming story of AAM is one of extraordinary collective sacrifice for the greater good. When the plague runs its course in November 1666, it has ravaged AM for 14 months. Of the approximately 800 villagers present when the outbreak began, only about 340 remain alive. Entire family lineages were extinguished. The social fabric of the village is torn with gaps that will take generations to repair. However, their sacrifice achieves its goal. The plague remains contained within the boundaries of Em. Neighboring communities, which almost certainly would have been infected if the villagers had fled, are spared the devastation. Thousands of lives are saved thanks to the deliberate decision of a few hundred people who prefer to face death rather than spread it. In the quiet aftermath, as the survivors begin the long process of rebuilding their shattered community, they cannot know the legacy they have created. They cannot imagine that 3.5 centuries later, their story will continue to be told as an example of extraordinary courage and community sacrifice. They cannot know that the plague which devastated their village was the last major outbreak of bubonic plague in England. That something in the particular strain of Yersinia pestis that struck in the decade of 1660 would make it less viable in later years, nor that improvements to sanitation and housing would gradually reduce the rat populations that spread the disease. They cannot know that future scientists will be deeply interested in their descendants and will discover unusually high rates of the CCR5 Delta 32 mutation among people whose family lineages go back to the survivors of M. More solid tests of how infectious diseases shape human evolution through natural selection. And of course, they cannot know that their example will resonate with special intensity at the beginning of the 21st century, when a global pandemic will once again force communities around the world to make hard decisions about isolation, quarantine, and collective sacrifice for the common good. The only thing they know is that they have survived an almost incomprehensible ordeal. They have seen dozens of neighbors, friends, and family members die. They have maintained self-imposed isolation during the heat of summer and the cold of winter, despite fear, pain, and unimaginable loss. And now, when the plague finally releases its grip on their village, they must find a way to continue living. The survivors of AAM face immediate practical challenges. The fields have been abandoned. Businesses have gone bankrupt. The houses are in ruins. With so many dead, traditional family structures have collapsed. Orphan children need a home. Widows and widowers must decide whether to remarry. The ownership of goods is complicated when entire families have been wiped out. However, the human capacity for resilience, which we have seen throughout our plague stories, is seen once again. New families are formed from the fragments of those destroyed by the disease. Distant relatives return to claim abandoned properties and bring new life to the decimated town. Those with useful skills are in high demand, being able to obtain better pay than before. The plague has acted as a terrible but effective form of natural selection. Those who survive, whether by genetic resistance, circumstantial luck, or a combination of factors, become the basis for the rebirth of the town. Their descendants will carry the genetic legacy of plague resistance, although they will not understand this inheritance until many centuries have passed. For some survivors, the psychological scars never fully heal. Elizabeth Hancock, who buried her entire family with her own hands, eventually remarries and has more children, but the villagers say she was never quite the same. Sometimes, her gaze becomes distant, as if she sees ghosts of that terrible week in which death took all her loved ones. Marshall Howe, the unscrupulous gravedigger who survived against all odds, is somewhat marginalized despite his apparent immunity. The villagers remember how he looted the dead, and although his services were necessary during the crisis, peace brings with it the reckoning for his behavior. William Merson, shattered by the pain of the loss of his beloved wife, leaves AAM in 1669 to take a position elsewhere. He eventually remarries and lives to be 71 years old, but his letters reveal that he never forgot the horror of those months of plague or the sacrifice of his Catherine. As for the town, it gradually recovers its population, although some surnames disappear forever from its records. Quarantine becomes part of local legislation, a story that is passed down from generation to generation with pride and sadness. In the 19th century, when Victorian England develops a great interest in outstanding historical episodes, the story of AM is rediscovered and popularized. The plague town, as it is known, begins to attract visitors curious about its tragic past. The Riley tombs, the border stones, and other physical vestiges of the quarantine become informal monuments. In the 21st century, AAM is a consolidated stop on the heritage tourism routes that cross Derbyshire. The town museum tells the story of the plague and the quarantine. The parish church exhibits artifacts and commemorations. Since 1866, a Sunday service has been held annually in memory of the plague, in remembrance of the community sacrifice. But AAM is not a simple historical curiosity. It is still a living community where the descendants of the plague survivors still live. Some bear the same surnames as those who lived through the outbreak of 1665 to 1666. The Hancocks, the Siddles, the Blackwells, and as some genetic tests have revealed, are still carriers of the CCR5 Delta 32 mutation that may have saved their ancestors from a plague. The story of AM reminds us that history is not simply a collection of dates and events to be memorized. It is the lived experience of real people who faced extraordinary circumstances. People whose decisions, sacrifices, and survival shaped the world in which we live today. As the soft darkness of sleep envelopes you more deeply, take with you the image of the village of M as it is today, quiet, picturesque, with its little stone houses and its flowery gardens that barely give a clue of the tragedy that once unfolded there. However, on the commemorative plaques of the border stones preserved in the tombs of the Rileys, carefully cared for on the hillside, the past remains present. The villagers who decided to isolate themselves, knowing that many would die as a consequence, could not imagine how long their history would last or how significant it would be for future generations. They acted moved by the immediate concern for their neighbors in the surrounding communities, not for any historical legacy. And perhaps that is what makes their sacrifice so powerful. They did it without expecting recognition or reward, simply because it was the right thing. In a world that often seems to prioritize individual benefit over collective well-being, AM reminds us that human beings are capable of extraordinary altruism when circumstances demand it. Tomorrow night, we will explore how the world changed after these plague outbreaks, how societies rebuilt, how power structures changed, and how the biological legacy of plague resistance continues to influence human health even in our modern era. But for now, let the courage of the villages of M accompany us in our dreams, a silent testimony to humanity's capacity for sacrifice, survival, and ultimately hope. Let's travel now to the aftermath of the Black Death of the 14th century. While the story of M, set in the 1660s, shows us the courage of a single people, the great pandemic of the 14th century transformed entire societies. As we delve into this historical dreamscape, let's explore how surviving such a catastrophe reshaped the medieval world. Imagine yourself again in that small town we visited earlier. But now it is 1352. The first waves of the plague have finally subsided, leaving a transformed landscape, both physically and socially. As you walk through the town that was once home to 200 souls, you count perhaps 90 people remaining. The empty cabins stand like hollow-eyed skulls along the road. Their thatched roofs are beginning to collapse for lack of maintenance. Their gardens are overgrown with weeds. However, amidst this desolation, subtle signs of change appear. Changes that will end up altering the very foundations of medieval society. In the fields surrounding the town, the transformation is immediately visible. Before the plague, all available land was cultivated, even marginal soils that produced meager harvests. Population growth for generations had pushed agriculture onto increasingly less productive land, as people desperately tried to produce enough food for their growing families. Now, with so many dead, land is suddenly abundant. The survivors completely abandon the less fertile fields and focus their work on the best soils. This simple change drastically improves crop yields per person, where before a peasant family might struggle to produce enough to feed themselves after paying taxes and tithes. Now they often harvest a surplus. For those who survive the apocalyptic mortality, food is more abundant than it had been in their entire lives. After centuries of living on the brink of starvation, this abundance seems like a miracle, a small compensation for the emotional devastation of losing so many family members and neighbors. Changes in diet are not long in coming. Before the plague, most peasants fed themselves mainly on cereals. Bread, porridge, and beer constituted most of their diet, and meat was an uncommon luxury. Now, with fewer mouths to feed and more land available, many turn fields into pastures to raise animals. Meat, cheese, and butter appear more frequently on the humble tables. The average height of the population, which had decreased due to poor diet, begins to increase again as the diet improves. But the most profound changes occur in the relationship between workers and landowners. The enormous loss of population, approximately half of the European population, creates a severe labor shortage. The fields still need to be plowed, the crops must be harvested, the fabrics must be woven, and the buildings must be repaired. However, There are simply not enough hands to do all the necessary work. For the peasants and artisans who have survived, this new reality represents an unprecedented advantage. Let's consider the case of Thomas Fletcher, a plowman from your town. Before the plague, he worked in the fields 6 days a week in exchange for a small plot of land to cultivate for him and his family. If he complained or did not perform the required work, dozens of other hungry peasants were willing to take his place. Now, with half of the town's workers dead, the local administrator approaches Thomas with an extraordinary offer: a larger plot of land, a reduction in the working day from 6 to 3 days, and the freedom to work for a salary on other farms if he wishes. The administrator does not make this offer out of generosity, but out of necessity. Without Thomas's ability to plow, the fields would go to waste, and everyone, including the lord of the estate, would suffer. Similar scenes are repeated throughout Europe. The peasants who for generations have been tied to the land as serfs suddenly find themselves with options. Many landowners offer freedom in exchange for workers staying on their farms. Others convert labor obligations into simple rent, which allows peasants to cultivate the land as they see fit, so long as they pay the agreed amount. For skilled workers, the changes are even more drastic. Masons, carpenters, blacksmiths, weavers all see how their services are in desperate demand. The salaries of these workers double, triple, or even quadruple in the years right after the plague. A skilled carpenter who previously could barely feed his family now builds a 2-room house with glass windows, dresses better, and eats meat thrice weekly. These changes alarmed the nobility and wealthy merchant classes. They saw how the traditional social order was crumbling, as former serfs demanded better treatment and common workers lived like small landowners. Throughout Europe, authorities try to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and force workers to return to their previous conditions. In England, the government enacts the Ordinance of the Workers in 1349, followed by a more complete statute in 1351. These laws prohibit employers from offering higher wages than paid before the plague, prohibit workers from leaving their homes to search for better opportunities elsewhere, and attempt to fix the prices of food and other goods. Similar laws are passed throughout Europe. France enacts wage controls in 1351, as does the city-state of Florence. The Spanish Kingdom of Castilla attempts to prevent peasant mobility with its own labor laws. But these efforts largely fail. The labor shortage is simply too severe. The economic pressures are too great. Law enforcement proves almost impossible in rural areas, where local officials themselves, who often depend on good relations with workers, turn a blind eye to violations. Workers develop creative ways to circumvent wage controls. A carpenter who is prohibited from accepting more than a certain daily wage may receive gifts of food, clothing, or lodging in addition to his official salary. A day laborer may work slowly or carelessly unless offered better conditions than those permitted by law. For those who enforce the laws, the mathematics are relentless. Before the plague, a lord could have 100 peasants working on his lands. Now he has 50 or fewer. Punishing a worker with jail or fines only worsens the labor shortage. And if he treats his workers too harshly, they could simply leave, regardless of the legal prohibitions against such mobility, knowing that they will find a welcome job elsewhere. The situation reaches a critical point in various peasant revolts throughout Europe. In 1358, the rural areas around Paris erupt in the Jacquerie Rebellion, when peasants attack castles and noble estates. Although brutally suppressed, it demonstrated the new confidence of the working classes. In England, tensions built for decades until in 1381 they erupted in the peasant revolt. Led by Wat Tyler, Jack Straw, and a radical priest named John Ball, tens of thousands of commoners marched on London demanding the end of serfdom, the abolition of the hated poll tax, and greater social equality. John Ball's famous sermon captures the revolutionary spirit of the moment. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? He asked rhetorically, questioning the very idea of aristocratic privilege. From the beginning, all men were created equal, and our slavery or servitude came with the unjust oppression of evil men. Although the English revolt, like that of the Jacquerie, was eventually suppressed by a combination of false promises and brutal force. It represents a profound shift in consciousness. The peasants who previously accepted their subordinate position as something divine now openly question the social hierarchy. Workers who previously had no choice but to accept the conditions offered to them now demand better treatment as something that belongs to them. The economic and social transformations that followed the plague were not limited to rural areas. Cities experienced their own profound changes. Urban centers suffered especially high mortality during the pandemic due to crowded conditions. Florence, one of the largest cities in medieval Europe, loses up to 75% of its population. This devastating loss creates opportunities for the survivors. Housing, previously scarce and expensive in prosperous cities, suddenly becomes abundant and affordable. Apprentices are elevated to the category of masters years earlier than normal, as the guilds lose many of their older members. Women, traditionally excluded from many professions, access trades that have become vacant due to the death of their male relatives. Consider the story of Margarita, widow of a weaver in a small market town. Before the plague, she was allowed to help her husband in his workshop, but she could not work as an independent artisan. Guild rules expressly prohibited women from owning a weaving business. When her husband dies of plague, leaving Margarita with her tools, her loom, and the experience she had acquired working alongside him, the diminished guild of weavers faces a decision: enforce the ban on admitting women and lose a skilled artisan, or adapt to the new reality. Faced with the decrease in the number of members and the increase in the demand for fabrics, the union admits Margarita as a full member, one of the many similar commitments that are reached throughout Europe, where necessity prevails over tradition. Although these opportunities for women would eventually diminish as the population recovered in the generations after the plague, women enjoyed a broader economic role, unimaginable before the pandemic. The aftermath of the plague also saw changes in fashion, art, and architecture. The immense mortality creates new awareness of the inevitability of death and life's fragility. The macabre emerges as an artistic theme. Skeletal figures, skulls, scenes of the dance of death, in which skeletons lead people of all social classes to the grave. However, alongside this morbid fascination, a celebration of life and its pleasures arises. The survivors, perhaps aware of how quickly existence can end, embrace luxury and beauty with renewed appreciation. Among those who could afford it, clothing became more elaborate and colorful. The practical and plain garments of the early medieval period give way to rich fabrics, bold designs, and styles that denote status. The nobility, alarmed by the fact that commoners dress above their station, tries to impose sumptuary laws that dictate what each social class can wear. These edicts, like wage controls, proved largely unenforceable. The wife of a prosperous craftsman could technically be prohibited from wearing silk, but if she could afford it, who in her community had the authority and motivation to prevent it? Religious attitudes also undergo their own transformation. The church, which had dominated medieval intellectual and spiritual life, faced a crisis of authority. Many priests and monks fled their posts during the plague, abandoning their parishioners when they most needed spiritual comfort. Others stayed and died, leaving the parishes without leadership. Monasteries, with their communal way of life, suffered especially high mortality rates, meaning the loss of centuries of accumulated knowledge and traditions. More fundamentally, the plague raised uncomfortable theological questions. If the disaster is divine punishment, as many ecclesiastical authorities claim, why do the virtuous and sinners die equally? Why did devout monks perish while apparently impious laymen survive? If prayer and penance are the remedies, why do outbreaks usually affect monasteries more harshly? Traditional theology does not offer satisfactory answers. Instead, two divergent religious trends developed. Some survivors embraced an even more fervent piety, seeing their survival as proof of divine favor that demands grateful devotion. Others adopted a more skeptical and questioning attitude, towards religious authorities who failed to explain or mitigate the catastrophe. This questioning spirit, combined with the economic changes that provided ordinary people with more resources and free time, created fertile ground for the intellectual flourishing that would eventually become the Renaissance. When there are fewer hands to produce the goods needed for society, more minds can dedicate themselves to art, philosophy, science, and literature. Education, previously restricted mainly to the clergy and nobility, gradually opened up to a wider segment of society. The new prosperous merchants and artisans wanted their children to learn to read, write, and do accounts, skills useful for business, and that marked social status. Small schools appeared in the cities and even in the larger towns, where practical knowledge was taught along with traditional religious instruction. The demographic impact of the plague also accelerated technological innovation. With labor scarce and expensive, techniques that saved human effort became increasingly valuable. Water mills, used for a long time to grind grain, were adapted to new purposes, operating the bellows of blast furnaces, driving hammers to work metal, fulling wool, printing. Technology, which would end up revolutionizing the dissemination of knowledge in Europe, received an initial boost from the shortage of labor after the plague. Handwritten manuscripts, each requiring months of work from a skilled scribe, became prohibitively expensive when these workers could demand high wages. The economic pressure to find mechanical alternatives contributed to the development of printing with movable type in the mid-15th century. Perhaps most profoundly, the experience of the plague shook the acceptance of immutable tradition in medieval Europe. When half the population died in a few years, when social hierarchies collapsed and were rebuilt in new ways, when authorities that were once unquestionable could not provide protection or explanations, the idea that the world must remain as it always has loses its power. After the Black Death, more people could imagine alternatives to existing arrangements. Different ways of organizing work, distributing resources, structuring authority. Most of these alternatives are never carried out, and many of those that are implemented prove temporary. But the psychological barrier against change itself weakened, creating space for innovations in thought, technology, art, and social organization that would eventually transform medieval Europe into the early modern world. For the people who lived through these changes, the experience had less to do with great historical transformations and more with practical daily adjustments. Tomas, the farmer, did not think about the decline of feudalism. He thought about negotiating better conditions with the butler so that his family could eat better than before. Margarita, the weaver, did not consider herself part of a gender revolution. She simply used her skills to support herself after losing her husband. However, these individual adaptations multiplied among millions of survivors throughout Europe, collectively reshaped society. Just as water gradually wears away stone, the countless small decisions made by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances erode and eventually transform the seemingly solid structures of medieval life. Not all these changes are immediately positive. Of course, the labor shortage benefiting workers creates difficulties for many landowners. Some farms go completely bankrupt, since their owners cannot adapt to the new economic realities. The churches, monasteries, and charitable institutions that depended on stable rents and donations struggled to maintain their operations with reduced income. Criminal activity increased in some areas, since young people with better incomes and little supervision spent freely on alcohol and got into trouble. Abandoned properties in rural areas sometimes became havens for outlaws. Urban governments were concerned about maintaining order with diminished surveillance forces. For several decades after the initial outbreak of the plague, small recurrent epidemics continued to plague European communities, preventing population recovery and reinforcing the economic and social changes initiated by the first pandemic. It is not until the end of the 15th century that the European population begins to grow again in a sustained way, and it is necessary to wait until the 17th century to reach pre-plague levels in many regions. This prolonged demographic depression causes the changes set in motion by the Black Death to take hold. What could have been temporary disturbances become new norms when demographic pressure begins to reverse some of the gains for common workers. Other aspects of medieval society have been permanently altered. For the peasant family that we have followed throughout our history, the decades after the plague bring gradual improvement. Your brother, who miraculously survived the disease, ends up taking over a neighboring farm that was left empty after the death of the entire family. What would have been impossible before the plague, that a peasant accumulate significant property, becomes achievable in the depopulated countryside. Your father, whose skills as a carpenter are in high demand, gets a contract to help rebuild the local church, damaged by years of neglect during the plague years. The payment he receives allows him to add a second room to your family's cabin and replace the dirt floor with wooden planks. Small luxuries that would have seemed unimaginable in the pre-plague era. Your mother teaches you and your sister to read, a skill she learned while working as a maid in a merchant's house before she married. Before the plague, such knowledge would have had little practical value for peasant children. But in the changing world of the late 14th century, literacy opens doors that were previously closed to the humble. One autumn afternoon, as your family gathers around the hearth after a day's work, your father utters words that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Perhaps you could be a clergyman, he tells you, nodding thoughtfully. The abbey is looking for someone who can read and write to help with their records. The salary is good, and the work is not hard. Your brother laughs without malice. A clergyman from our family, what would grandfather say? The idea that a peasant's son would dedicate himself to that work would have seemed absurd to previous generations, for whom rigid social boundaries seemed as natural and immovable as the stars. But as you fall asleep that night, the possibility settles in your mind, not as a far-fetched dream, but as a real opportunity. This is perhaps the most significant legacy of the Black Death. Not only the immediate changes in wages, working conditions, and social structures, but the expansion of what common people can imagine for themselves and their children. As dawn approaches, and this part of our historical journey comes to an end, we leave you at this moment of possibilities. Your world has been shattered by incomprehensible loss, and then slowly rebuilt into something different than it was before. The medieval certainties that once governed life have been questioned, challenged, and, in some cases, overthrown. What they cannot know as survivors of these changes is that they are at a crucial moment in Western history. The adaptations, innovations, and reconsiderations imposed by the plague will eventually contribute to the Renaissance, the Reformation, and, ultimately, the emergence of the modern world. But that is a story for our last night together, when we will explore how the long shadow of the Black Death extends throughout the centuries, influencing art, science, medicine, and society in ways that continue to shape our current world. As our journey through the world of plague survivors comes to an end, let us broaden our vision to see how the waves of the Black Death continue to propagate through time, shaping the world in subtle and profound ways. The echoes of this medieval catastrophe still resonate today in our bodies, our societies, and our understanding of disease. Let's start with perhaps the most remarkable legacy, the biological inheritance carried by the descendants of the plague survivors. Do you remember the CCR5 Delta 32 mutation we talked about? That genetic peculiarity that protected some medieval Europeans from the plague. This small variation in DNA did not disappear when the plague subsided. It was passed down from generation to generation, enriching the European gene pool, as those who carried it were more likely to survive and have children. Let's move forward 600 years to the late 20th century. A new pandemic emerges. HIV, AIDS kills millions of people worldwide. Medical researchers rushing to understand this new disease make a surprising discovery. Some people appear naturally resistant to HIV infection despite repeated exposure. Later investigations revealed why many people are carriers of the CCR5 Delta 32 mutation, the same genetic variation that helped their ancestors survive the Black Death. The connection becomes clear when scientists understand how both diseases work. Both the plague bacterium and HIV use the CCR5 protein as a gateway into human cells. The delta 32 mutation alters this protein, effectively blocking the door through which these pathogens try to enter. A genetic adaptation selected by a deadly disease in the 14th century unexpectedly provides protection against a different threat in the 20th century. This discovery led to the development of new drugs against HIV that block the CCR5 receptor, mimicking what the mutation does naturally. In a very real sense, the survivors of the medieval plague helped save lives in our modern era. Their genetic legacy provides a crucial clue in the fight against a disease that they could never have imagined. But the biological impact of the plague goes beyond just this mutation. The Black Death acted as an intense force of natural selection, which may have influenced other aspects of the immune systems of Europeans. The current population descends disproportionately from the survivors, those whose bodies, for various genetic reasons, were better able to resist the attack by Yersinia pestis. Some scientists theorize that certain autoimmune diseases more common in European populations, conditions in which the immune system attacks the body's own tissues, could be an unintended consequence of this selection. Our ancestors survived the plague because their immune responses were especially vigorous. However, that same elevated reactivity may predispose their descendants to diseases such as rheumatoid arthritis or multiple sclerosis, in which the immune system becomes overactive. These biological connections between the past and the present remind us that pandemics are not limited to killing and disappearing from history. They restructure the genetic composition of the surviving population, creating changes that persist for centuries or even millennia after the immediate crisis has passed. The social and economic transformations of the Black Death were equally lasting. Although the immediate consequences, labor shortages, wage increases, and social mobility that we explored last night faded with the recovery of the European population, certain fundamental changes became permanent. Consider the institution of serfdom, which had tied peasants to the land for generations before the plague. In Western Europe, this system never fully recovered from the disruption that was caused by the Black Death. Although landowners tried to reimpose the old restrictions, the demographic reality worked against them. Land remained relatively abundant and labor scarce for centuries, giving workers an advantage that gradually eroded feudal obligations. By the end of the Middle Ages, serfdom had largely disappeared from England, France, and the Netherlands, replaced by various rental agreements that allowed much greater personal freedom. Peasants continued to work the land, but increasingly as tenants who paid rent rather than as serfs subject to hereditary obligations of labor and servitude. Eastern Europe followed a different path. There, the nobility managed to reimpose and even reinforce serfdom after the plague, creating what historians call the Second Serfdom, which would persist until the 19th century. This divergence between the social systems of Western and Eastern Europe, one moving towards greater freedom for the common people and the other towards more rigid control, would profoundly influence the subsequent development of these regions. The Black Death also accelerated fundamental changes in religious life. The Catholic Church, which had dominated medieval intellectual and spiritual life, faced challenges to its authority after the plague. Questions about why prayers were not heard, why religious processions failed to stop the disease, and why devout monks died alongside sinners created cracks in the building of unquestionable faith. These cracks would widen in the centuries that followed. The 16th century Protestant Reformation, with its challenge to Catholic authority and its emphasis on individual interpretation of Scripture, found fertile ground in a population already predisposed to question religious orthodoxy. Although the Reformation had many causes, historians see echoes of the disillusionment of the plague era in the willingness of millions of people to break with centuries of tradition. Even art and literature were transformed by the experience of the Black Death. Medieval works of art used a focus on religious themes, depicting biblical stories, lives of saints, and divine figures. After the plague, new motifs appeared. The Dance of Death, which showed skeletons leading people of all social classes to the grave. Reminders of mortality in still life paintings. A greater focus on the human experience rather than purely divine matters. This shift towards humanism, Attention to human experience, emotions, and achievements would flourish in the Renaissance, along with recovered classical knowledge. Recovered classical knowledge from Greek and Roman sources. This human-centered perspective would fundamentally alter the way Europeans understood themselves and their world. The impact of the plague even extended to language. Our modern English vocabulary still retains echoes of the Black Death experience. We talk about quarantine, a word derived from the Italian quarantina giorni, or 40 days, the time ships had to remain isolated in Venetian ports during plague outbreaks. We describe someone as having a deadline. Originally a line drawn around a prison beyond which guards could shoot escaping prisoners, similar to the boundaries drawn around plague quarantine zones. Even seemingly innocuous nursery rhymes can contain memories of the plague. Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes we all fall down has been interpreted by some as a reference to the symptoms of the plague. The pink rash, the attempted remedies, the sweet-smelling bouquets carried to ward off the disease, and the ashes of cremation falling with death. Although scholars debate this interpretation, it suggests how deeply rooted the images of the plague can be in cultural memory. The Black Plague also transformed humanity's relationship with the disease itself. Before the plague, the disease was generally considered a divine punishment or the result of an imbalance of bodily humors, with no concept of contagion existing as we understand it today. The evident pattern of propagation of the plague, transmitted through commercial routes and from person to person in close contact, made it impossible to ignore the contagious nature of at least some diseases. The communities developed practical responses that, although they were not based on the theory of the germs, that would not arise until the 19th century, incorporated effective public health measures. The ships were put in quarantine, the infected homes were isolated, and often the victims of the plague and their belongings were burned. The cities named public health boards with extraordinary powers during outbreaks, establishing principles of epidemic management that would influence public health practices for centuries. These pragmatic approaches, developed through bitter experience more than scientific knowledge, saved countless lives in subsequent plague outbreaks. When the last great epidemic of European plague struck Marseille in 1720, the authorities had learned to implement sanitary cordons, strict quarantines, and careful surveillance that managed to limit the outbreak largely to that city and its surroundings. Of course, these measures arrived too late for the millions of people who perished in the initial pandemic. But the knowledge acquired from the Black Death helped to mitigate subsequent outbreaks of plague and to give informed responses to other epidemic diseases. When cholera struck Europe in the 19th century, those responsible for public health relied on plague management traditions to contain its spread, imperfectly at first, but with increasing effectiveness as scientific knowledge improved. The plague's legacy extends even to the management of modern pandemics. Many of the approaches employed during the recent COVID-19 outbreaks, such as quarantines, travel restrictions, contact tracing, and the isolation of those infected, have their roots in methods developed centuries ago in response to the Black Plague. Even the tension between the economic impact and the public health measures echoes the medieval debates about whether to close the doors of the cities and the markets during the outbreaks of plague. Perhaps the most profound is that the experience of the Black Plague shaped the way in which human beings think about the catastrophe in itself. Medieval Europeans lived in a world where sudden disasters seemed omnipresent. The wars, the famines, and the outbreaks of minor diseases regularly claimed lives. But the scale and the speed of the plague surpassed everything that was remembered or had been recorded in history. This encounter with an almost apocalyptic mortality forced a collective psychological adjustment. The communities that survived learned they could endure previously unimaginable losses and move on. The individuals discovered reserves of resilience that they might never have known they possessed. Societies developed an institutional memory and adaptive practices for future crises. This capacity for resilience in the face of catastrophes continues to be one of humanity's most valuable assets. Throughout history, communities have faced disasters that seemed insurmountable. However, somehow life continues. People mourn their dead, rebuild their settlements, adapt their practices, and move on, carrying the memory of what was lost and creating something new from what remains. This pattern repeats after each major catastrophe. From the volcanic eruption that buried Pompeii to the earthquake that devastated Lisbon in 1755, from the flu pandemic of 1918 to more recent natural disasters and disease outbreaks. The Black Plague, perhaps the most extreme example of such calamity in recorded history, demonstrated the remarkable human capacity to endure, adapt, and ultimately continue. This is not to minimize the suffering such events caused. The plague brought unimaginable pain, shattered families and communities, and ended millions of unique lives, each containing a universe of experiences and potential. No positive aspect of social change or biological adaptation can justify such a loss. However, understanding how humanity overcame this storm offers us perspective on our own capacity to face present and future challenges. Climate change, emerging diseases, technological disruptions. Our world has no lack of existential threats. The history of the Black Plague reminds us that previous generations faced apparently insurmountable crises and found ways to continue. For the individual plague survivors whose stories we have followed these last nights, those great historical patterns would have meant little compared with their immediate vital experience. Thomas, the farmer who negotiated better working conditions in the labor shortage after the plague, was not thinking about the long-term decline of feudalism. Elizabeth Hancock, who buried her family on the hillside above Eam, could not imagine that her genetic legacy could protect her descendant from a 20th century disease. However, collectively, these experiences and individual adaptations created the radical changes that transformed medieval society into something new. This is often how history works, not only through the conscious decisions of great leaders or dramatic turning points, but through the accumulated effects of millions of ordinary people who respond to extraordinary circumstances as best they can. When concluding our trip through the world of the plague survivors, what lessons can we extract from their experience? Perhaps the most fundamental is an appreciation for human resilience. The Black Plague caused almost incomprehensible losses. Half the population in many areas. Entire families and towns were razed. Centuries of knowledge and accumulated culture were lost with those who carried them. However, somehow, the survivors gathered the will to continue rebuilding, to create new families and communities from the fragments of what remained. We could also reflect on how catastrophes, despite all their horror, sometimes create possibilities. The rigid social structures of medieval Europe that seemed as immutable as the change of the seasons proved to be vulnerable to the disruption when the demographic realities changed. The people who were previously confined to predetermined social roles found new opportunities after the catastrophe. Although we would never wish that disaster were the agent of change, history shows transformation often arises from a crisis. The history of the plague also reminds us of our biological connection, both between ourselves and with the countless microscopic organisms with which we share the planet. The Black Plague bacteria, Yersinia pestis, shaped human genetics, social structures, and economic systems in a way that continues to influence our current world's cultural expressions. Other microbes played equally influential roles in history. We exist in a constant relationship with an invisible biological world that can sustain and threaten us. Finally, perhaps the history of the plague offers perspective on our own vulnerability and mortality. The people of the Middle Ages lived with death as a constant companion, in a way that most modern Westerners do not. The plague further highlighted mortality, inspiring works of art, literature, and philosophy that contemplated the fragility and brevity of life. This awareness need not be morbid or depressing. In fact, many of those who survived the plague embraced life with renewed appreciation, understanding firsthand how quickly and unexpectedly it could end. There is wisdom in this perspective, not a fearful obsession with death, but a lucid recognition of how precious life is precisely because it's limited and uncertain. As we finish our story and approach sleep, Let us imagine once again that medieval village we first visited, now a generation after the plague has passed. The population has begun to recover, with new children playing in the streets and young families occupying houses empty for years. The survivors, now elderly, still retain the memory of what happened, both the horrors they witnessed and the changes they helped create afterward. They could not know how their experience would resonate throughout the centuries, influencing everything from genetic inheritance to social structures, and from artistic expression to public health approaches. They simply lived their lives as best they could in circumstances they never chose, showing the remarkable human capacity for adaptation and perseverance that has led our species to overcome countless challenges. And perhaps that is the most comforting thought with which we can sleep, that we, like the survivors of the plague, possess resources of resilience and adaptability that we may not recognize until circumstances demand them. That life, despite its fragility, shows a persistent tendency to continue, rebuild, and find new paths when old ones are blocked. The survivors of the Black Plague could never have imagined our world with its medical technologies, instantaneous global communication, and scientific knowledge of the bacteria that caused their suffering. Nor can we fully imagine the world in which our descendants will live in several generations. But, like those medieval ancestors, we move forward, carrying with us both the wounds of past catastrophes and the lessons learned from surviving them, contributing, in small and large ways, to the development of human history. Sleep well, knowing that you are part of this long continuity of human experience, connected with those who preceded you and with those who will follow you. Each generation faces its own unique challenges. Each finds its own way to resist, adapt, and continue the extraordinary journey of our species through time.